All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Global Agenda at the University of Delaware. I'm Ralph Begleiter. Long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away, I worked as a journalist for a man named Ted Turner. Probably best known for creating the world's first all-news television network, CNN, in 1980. But Ted was known for other things. Back in the day, he was very boastful of CNN. And even among those of us who worked for him, he was known as something of a loose cannon. We never really knew what he might say or do next. A lifelong resident of Atlanta, he became widely known as the mouth from the South. His aides were always scurrying around, cleaning up after his usually well-meaning, but sometimes offensive and unsophisticated remarks about others. Because he wouldn't dispute this, by the way. Because he liked to sail, he entered his yacht, the Courageous, in the America's Cup in 1977, and he won. After that, he loved it when people called him Captain Courageous. Later, usually when he said something embarrassing, people called him Captain Outrageous. Turner is known for outrageous schemes. When his reporters couldn't gain access to the White House press room, he sued the White House, and he won. When he couldn't buy rights to broadcast the Olympics one year, he created his own version called the Goodwill Games with the Soviet Union. He tried to buy the venerable CBS network, perhaps more than once. And he bought MGM with all its classic movies, a much criticized decision at the time, but which has also added immensely to his wealth. He colorized many of those old black and white movies, enduring a lot of criticism for changing them. Later, he created the Cartoon Network, which to this day is one of the most widely watched networks in the world, and a real money machine. At first, CNN was a money loser. In fact, almost everyone thought Ted would lose his shirt in his crusade to get people to actually watch an all-news network. But as CNN developed into the news channel, not only in the US but around the world, he gained new respect. And in the 1990s, he amassed a fortune and a media empire. In 1996, he sold his company to Time Warner, adding significantly to his wealth. I imagine by now you're probably wondering why I'm telling you all this, but bear with me, there is a connection to the politics of climate change. In the early 1990s, Turner came up with the idea of an animated environmentalist TV show about an environmental superhero called Captain Planet. It's still running in syndication around the world. Ted always had an environmentalist streak. By the late 1990s, turning to philanthropy, Ted focused on two key areas of interest: getting rid of nuclear weapons and taking care of the environment. He created a foundation which is still active on the nuclear proliferation issues. And in 1997, at a time when the United States was in arrears on its dues to the United Nations, Captain Outrageous stunned those of us who worked for him, and the world really, by announcing he would give $1 billion to the United Nations. It was the largest gift ever to the United Nations, and it literally shamed a reluctant U.S. Congress into paying the American bills to the UN. The gift was so bizarre, so unprecedented, that his aides had to run around figuring out how to accomplish this. He created the UN Foundation, which is channeling his money to the United Nations on a variety of initiatives, including environmental ones. Which brings me to our guest speaker tonight, Janet Hall. Janet is a senior policy analyst at the UN Foundation, currently working on the climate change initiatives. She has served as a counselor to the U.S. trade representatives in Washington, where she focused on how to help the world's poorest nations. She focused on corporate governance, intellectual property, and other issues there. She worked on setting up World Trade Organization strategies that would help too. In another life, she worked for Westinghouse Electric, where she focused on international business. Before that, she was a career Foreign Service officer in the State Department. Ms. Hall earned her bachelor's degree in government from Barnard College at Columbia and her Master's in International Relations from Georgetown University. Please welcome Janet Hall.
Thank you.
Captain Outrageous.
Okay, it's good. Thank you, Ralph, for that introduction. It made me laugh quite a bit. I applaud Ralph Begleiter for the exceptional Global Agenda program, which engages the university and the public in key international issues. I am particularly honored to have followed the previous speakers, IPCC Nobel laureate members, and the New York Times award-winning environmental reporter, Andrew Refkin. I would like to thank the university for this chance to discuss the energy poverty divide. I'm pleased to be back in Delaware. It's been several years since I visited this university. In 2002, I brought 50 to 60 young Egyptian economists here to the university to expose them to the range of exciting, innovative research taking place. At the time, I was creating strategies for young international trade professionals and for the Egyptian government, which was en route to joining the WTO, or the World Trade Organization, and determined that it needed more knowledge and understanding as to how we in the United States conducted international trade policy. I felt it was important for the economists to understand the role that states play in the conduct of international trade, and I selected Delaware and Maryland as two states to showcase. I'm speaking to you tonight with the experience, as Ralph said, of a career Foreign Service officer, a Fortune 25 Energy Corporation international executive, an international trade counselor, and a senior policy advisor with the UN Foundation and its work on international bioenergy. And I'm also speaking with a little bit of a raspy voice, so I hope you'll bear with me. The UN Foundation is a public charity, as Ralph has described. Over the last 4 years, the UN Foundation has been working with UN agencies to support developing countries' endeavors to expand the sustainable production, use, and management of bioenergy. This has been a very exciting time. In 2005, the UN Foundation launched the International Bioenergy Initiative, known as IBI. This initiative aims to integrate in-country resources and international markets to achieve a viable bioenergy industry that can create sustainable rural development opportunities, generate livelihoods, increase farm incomes, provide access to energy, and improve the quality of life for all of us. Our work is focused in 4 main areas: information sharing, expanding energy access in developing countries, advocating sustainability, and promoting new trade opportunities. One way the UN Foundation accomplishes its goals is through a blend of advocacy, grant-making, and partnerships. One of the partnerships we have developed is with the Alliance of Small Island States. AOSIS, as it is known, is a coalition of small islands and low-lying coastal countries drawn from all oceans and regions of the world: Africa, the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean, Pacific, and South China Seas. These states share similar development challenges and are especially vulnerable to the effects of climate change. We at the UN Foundation are a key advisor of a project known as the Global Sustainable Energy Islands Initiative. This program helps small islands launch projects to reduce their vulnerability to observed or projected impacts of climate change, including diversifying crops, promoting less intensive water industries, and developing new and clean sources of energy such as bioenergy, wind, and geothermal. As Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, eloquently has said, quote, "Climate change affects us all, but it does not affect us all equally. Those who are least able to cope are being hit hardest. Those who have done the least to cause the problem bear the gravest consequences." End quote. This is certainly true for a nation like the Maldives. The Republic of the Maldives is a small island nation of about 300,000 people, distributed over nearly 200 inhabited islands. Its highest point is only about 8 feet above sea level. The Maldives is vulnerable to many of the negative consequences associated with climate change. These include the following 4 possible calamities: 1, sea level rise; 2, threats to potable water resources; 3, more volatile conditions for agriculture; and 4, new threats to human health. Take sea level rise. It is expected to exacerbate inundation, storm surge, erosion, and other coastal hazards, thus threatening the existence of shoreline communities, fish and shell habitats, other marine resources, and vital infrastructure. Higher sea levels will contaminate freshwater bodies along coastal areas with saline. The important role that coastal wetlands play in purifying water supplies and supporting wildlife will be greatly undermined. We could experience more intense periods of droughts and floods and higher temperatures. Different types of pests and the diseases that they carry could pose new threats to crops and our food supply. There is growing concern that global climate change is likely to endanger human health. Climate variability and change cause death and disease through natural disasters. In addition, many important diseases are highly sensitive to changing temperatures and precipitation. Furthermore, mosquitoes may spread diseases beyond the regions where they are now prevalent. In light of these threats, one measure being taken by the Maldives to adapt to climate change is the Safe Islands Program. Fears of sea level rise associated with global warming and the devastation caused by the 2004 tsunami led the Maldives to pursue this program. The program will create at least one focus or safe island for each island region. Each of these islands would also incorporate seawall defenses, environmental protection zones, specially constructed areas of high ground, and taller and stronger buildings. The safe islands will be encouraged to develop sustainable and affordable energy services and to promote renewable energy and energy efficiency. For small island states and for us, one important way to forestall a catastrophe is what you can do through the energy savings that come from energy efficiency. It's certainly far cheaper to save energy than it is to create energy. The average home in the U.S. spends about $1,900 on energy costs every year. Energy Star qualified appliances incorporate advanced technologies that use 10 to 50% less energy and water than standard models. If just 1 in 10 homes used Energy Star qualified appliances, which is a government program you probably know, the change would be like planting 1.7 million new acres of trees. According to Energy Star, using an Energy Star qualified dishwasher instead of hand washing saves nearly 5,000 gallons of water a year. Over the 11 years lifetime of a dishwasher, which is what it's supposed to be these days, that's enough water to provide a lifetime of drinking water for 4 people. Access to clean drinking water is as important to development as access to energy, and that is why the UN Foundation is a partner of the Global Water Challenge, which seeks to provide safe drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene education worldwide to people who lack these services. As a global community, we have common ground: climate change. Climate change poses many challenges to our planet and to our lives. One of the greatest challenges is how to advance the changes necessary to address climate change and to build a better future for developing countries. With these challenges, though, come many opportunities to address the risks. Tonight, I would like to spend some time exploring the challenges and the opportunities. Opportunities in which this university and your state can play a role. For poor nations, their ability to emerge out of poverty is linked to their access to modern energy services. More than 100 years after the invention of the light bulb, 1.6 billion people are still without access to electricity. According to a UN agency that is responsible for global agriculture initiatives, known as the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, 4 out of 5 people live without electricity in rural areas of developing countries. Mainly, these countries are in South Asia and in Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, more than 92% of the rural population is without electricity. Quote, "In the absence of radical new policies, 1.4 billion will still have no electricity in 30 years' time." Close quote. And that quote comes from the International Energy Agency. with the aim of addressing the greatest challenges faced by the poorest nations. In May, just about 6 weeks from now, the United Nations will convene the 16th session of the Commission on Sustainable Development. CSD 16 will focus on agriculture, rural development, land, drought, desertification, and Africa. This is a unique opportunity that brings governments, international organizations, NGOs, and the civil society together to focus on such urgent and challenging issues. Access to clean, affordable energy is vital to achieving poverty reduction and sustainable development. 2.4 billion people rely on traditional biomass for cooking and heating. Biomass, if I can just give a brief definition, is all organic substance produced from plants or animals. The traditional biomass that they must rely on in these countries harms their health. According to the World Health Organization, in relative terms, deaths related to biomass pollution kill more people, primarily women and children, than malaria and tuberculosis each year worldwide. Wood gathering leads to deforestation, which leads to erosion, setting off a series of environmental calamities. All these factors leave poor countries with little, if any, chance to develop. I would like to share with you what is happening in China. China is in a rapid transition toward industrialization and integration into the world economy as we know. However, this race to move from the 19th to the 21st century has had a high price, particularly on the environment. In spite of all the economic growth in China, the majority of farmers in the western regions still rely on traditional use of agricultural residues, forest biomass, and coal for cooking and heating. For example, one rural family in remote Yunnan province uses 14 to 16 tons of firewood per year, on average, for cooking, causing major damage to natural forests. In Guizhou province, 10 million poor farmers, 1 out of 4 people, suffer from severe health impacts due to the burning of coal inside their households. Let's talk about women and the lack of access to electricity. Women are still the poorest of the poor, concentrated in agrarian and informal economies, often working in hazardous conditions. Their opportunities to generate income are severely limited as they primarily shoulder responsibilities for unpaid family and household care. Gathering wood for home cooking and heating, and carrying water to supply household needs and irrigate farms, for example, can consume their days, leaving little time for studying or earning an income. The roles and responsibilities of women are directly linked to environmental sustainability, affecting conservation practices, land cultivation methods, and health. As previously mentioned, women and children are most affected by the use of traditional biomass for cooking. A mother's ill health is one of the principal reasons why households become poor and remain poor. Using renewable energy sources in rural communities dramatically improves women's health by sharply reducing household air pollution. There are also issues surrounding the logistical structure of energy access. It has been said that energy access is who you are and where you are. Let me repeat that. Energy access is who you are and where you are. Let's think outside the box for a moment and look at electricity distribution. For almost 30 years, developing countries have been waiting to become connected to the grid. Is this the best way to help those in need of energy access? It is perhaps necessary to create new financial institutions that will support new development mechanisms to help poor countries find access to modern energy services. By and large, only small steps have been taken to address poor countries' energy needs. The obstacles are enormous. The scale of poverty, the lack of capital, and know-how. The decisions that must be made about where to focus scarce financial resources for the biggest impact are complex ones. All that said, there are efforts underway. Let me tell you about one of them. On the Caribbean island of Dominica, there is an ongoing project to provide the island nation with renewable energy. The Eastern Caribbean Geothermal Development Project aims to meet the electricity requirements of Dominica and, interestingly, to export excess production to neighboring Guadeloupe and Martinique. Both are departments of France. Dominica also hopes to shift its dependence on fossil fuels for electricity, which is currently at 60%, to 100% renewable sources. The project is expected to cost, however, more than $365 million. To solve these problems, we need to think in new and creative ways about financing. There are innovative ideas under discussion to raise the capital necessary to fund these projects. Two such possible projects are a global islands stock exchange that could specialize in green, ethical, and fair trade investment vehicles and funds, and the idea of using islands as living laboratories for new technologies. Technologies that could be tested on these islands include the implementation of energy networks, technologies to conserve energy, expand consumer choice, and allow small producers and households to feed into a national grid. The role of nanotechnology in photovoltaics, fueling efficiency, and electric storage could also be piloted. If these island states that I've been discussing are able to fashion a coherent, integrated strategy, they can score an environmental trifecta. 1, climate change mitigation and adaptation. 2, sustainable development. And 3, increased trade and investment. We have a tremendous challenge and an opportunity ahead. Delaware can play a role in helping the world's poor develop in a sustainable way. This state is pioneering in the technologies and the expertise to build a clean energy future. We must work throughout the world to stimulate alternative energy technologies and develop new markets. Efforts are already in progress in different regions of the world. These need to be escalated. America's research expertise and leadership are urgently needed. We stand now at the same point we were when the Internet began in terms of energy opportunities. Innovation in bioenergy and renewable energy development is well underway in Delaware. A Center for Nanotechnology is looking at maximizing the electricity that can be generated by solar panels. Farms are raising crops that are being used in producing bioenergy resources. Another factor contributing to Delaware's perceived advantage in the field is Wilmington-based DuPont, which, as I'm sure everyone here knows, employs scientists and views its stake in nanotechnology as a key growth area. This is the group of actions that are going to make the difference in the future. There are other opportunities of a scale that could transform our global economy for the better. Clean, renewable energy resources that include bioenergy. Indeed, the emerging bioeconomy, which embraces products and services arising out of the biosciences, can bring benefits such as more eco-efficient and sustainable natural resources to an ever-growing global population. Delaware, as I said, can play a key role. Delaware could be the link to transforming poverty in developing countries. In solving the energy needs of the poor, we can also address other problems that are endemic to poverty. Here is a chance for our country and this state to lead. Now is the time for leadership and the time to work on new paths of cooperation. Both North-South and South-South cooperation are going to be crucial in dealing effectively with this global issue. North-South cooperation plays a crucial role, not only for funding and aiding poor nations, but also in R&D, capacity building, and technology transfer. One good example is the Memorandum of Understanding on Biofuels signed by Brazil and the United States last year as the world's largest producers of ethanol. Brazil and the U.S. are working bilaterally and multilaterally to bring the benefits of biofuels to less developed nations, starting with Central America and the Caribbean. South-South cooperation is also necessary. It is an alternative to North-South with its possible overtones of economic and cultural hegemony. There is the possibility to develop mutually beneficial technology, services, and trading relationships, promoting self-sufficiency among southern nations and strengthening economic ties among states whose market power is more equally matched than in North-South trading relationships. Here are some examples of South-South cooperation in the bioenergy field. India has invested in biofuels development in West Africa, and last month, India also signed a memorandum of understanding with South Africa on agricultural cooperation. Egypt is helping Tanzania with irrigation projects, and Brazil has invested in and assisted with biodiversity projects in Mozambique. The transformation that Brazil has made is truly remarkable. From the land of samba and soccer, it has become the world's leader in ethanol production. Their efforts are a strong foundation in establishing a clean energy economy. They put into place the right policies and public-private partnerships to establish themselves in the vanguard of bioenergy. Over the past 3 decades, they have accomplished a great deal with regard to the creation of flex fuel, which means that they can run autos with any mix of gasoline and ethanol. We in the U.S. can also lead in changing the energy paradigm, but we must also partner with our friends in the developing and developed world. Through these partnerships, we can advance innovation and enhance capacity building, and in doing so, strengthen our global role and grow the bioeconomy. Climate change is here, and it's real. The scale of its impact is the subject of much scientific research needed to provide guidance to policymakers and businesses. How we address climate change will be the key to helping poor countries become more prosperous. Thank you.
Grab you one.
Okay, that's all right.
Partly to give Janet's voice a moment of rest, but also because she brought with her a very short film that was produced by the United Nations Foundation in cooperation with the National Geographic. Sorry about the audio, we'll work on it. I'd like to see if we can show that now, give you a chance to take a sip of water too. This is this short film produced by the UN Foundation and National Geographic. Let's watch.
Planète Terre.
Планета Земля.
Planeta Tierra.
كوكب الأرض.
行星地球.
Planet Earth. In this vast universe of ours, we know of no other place so hospitable to life in its infinite variety. But today, climate change poses a clear and present danger. It threatens every species on Earth, increasing the number of extreme weather events that require international action. The time for leadership and meaningful initiatives is now. As part of an intergovernmental effort under UN leadership, the world's top scientists have concluded that our climate is changing, and they have issued urgent warnings about our future we can't afford to ignore. The IPCC reports leave no room for doubt. Global warming is a fact. And human activity, including the burning of fossil fuels, industrial emissions, and deforestation, are the main cause of climate change and its most dangerous side effects. The dramatic rise in greenhouse gases over the last 250 years, particularly carbon dioxide, has caused temperatures to rise across the globe, and this warming is projected to accelerate at an alarming and dangerous pace. Science is a powerful witness. Our world is undergoing a dramatic transformation. Dangerous atmospheric changes already observed and measured will continue for decades. Changes in precipitation patterns will intensify drought in some areas and aggravate flooding in others. And as the world's glaciers disappear and the oceans heat up, global sea levels may rise between 18 and 59 centimeters by the end of the century. The shrinking of Greenland's ice sheet and large-scale loss of ice in Antarctica could exacerbate the problem with unpredictable speed. Small island nations, already victimized by increased storm surges and beach erosion, could one day be lost to the sea. As climate change disrupts nature's balance, biodiversity suffers. In the oceans and on land, all of Earth's species are threatened. Some may disappear forever. Climate change could potentially compound growing population pressures on food supplies, already fragile in many places. Over the long term, worldwide agricultural yields will likely decrease drastically in all regions. And as always, the poorest among us are the most vulnerable. Rain-fed agriculture could drop 50% by 2020 in some African countries, increasing malnutrition and the need for emergency aid. Nearly 1/6 of the world's people rely on mountain glaciers for drinking water, crucial supplies which are expected to decline significantly as these glaciers melt away. 44% of the world's people live within 150 kilometers of the coast and will be exposed to more frequent and more destructive storms and coastal flooding, and rising sea levels, which may over time inundate low-lying countries, islands, and cities. Cities like Alexandria, Kolkata, Dhaka, Bangkok, and Shanghai, home to hundreds of millions of people. We will have to adapt. Regions that bear the least responsibility for what is happening will be among the hardest hit. We can shape a different future. The IPCC's reports that have been endorsed by more than 150 countries offer a range of options for moving forward together. Solutions exist, but there's no time to waste. First, we must stabilize global greenhouse gas emissions. Then, according to the world scientists, we could limit the rise in global temperature to 2 degrees Celsius and prevent the most severe impacts of climate change. If the world reduces its emissions by approximately 2/3 by the year 2050. This must be a global effort, and with real leadership, it can be done. All of us must change our consumption patterns. Improved conservation and energy efficiency could help enormously without requiring major expenditures. But it's largely up to governments to ensure that the right choices are available and attractive, like more efficient modes of transportation and better building codes. Better management of our forests can also play a vital role, helping the planet to heal itself by drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The IPCC also suggests we change the way we think about energy. The cost of fossil fuels should reflect their long-term impacts on climate change. A price on carbon emissions would encourage the development of alternative energy sources, and that would help developing countries choose a more environmentally sustainable course. We must act together, and we must act now. One way or another, the Earth will survive. By acting together, the world's leaders can ensure that we will too, and that the planet we leave behind for our children will be a place where they can thrive.
Thanks for bringing that. A couple of weeks ago, the students in my class had, as part of one of their assignments, to imagine what a video would be like on the subject that they were discussing. So now they've got lots of answers to that question they can use. Janet, let me ask you first. You've been involved in a lot of international negotiations on the issue of climate change, especially in recent years. You've met with people all around the world on virtually every continent. Is it difficult for you to talk about the problem of climate change being exacerbated by people gathering and burning wood for cooking when they look at you and say, you're an American and you're talking about cooking fire as being the problem that we have to solve, as distinct from the problems in the industrial world in Europe, in North America, et cetera?
It's a very good question. I think, as in any situation, any negotiation, so much has to do with the relationship. So much has to do with your credibility. I think that we certainly spend a great deal of time working and developing the relationships with those in developing countries, and I think it has not therefore been as much of a perhaps challenge as you might think because of how we've gone about developing our strategy in the beginning.
Is there do you encounter a kind of resentment toward the industrial world, or is that a figment of the media's imagination or of our imagination generally?
No, I don't think it's a figment of your imagination or the media's imagination. I think there is resentment, particularly when there's a sense that the haves are supposedly telling the have-nots how to manage their economies. I think that's a real challenge. I think it's a delicate balancing act that has to be put into place. And I think if you approach this with the sensitivity of understanding the culture and understanding their sensitivities about their own rights and prerogatives, it works, I think, to our success.
Okay. Let's turn to questions from our audience. We're going to do the same thing we usually do, a question from a student alternating with a question from a non-student. Who's going to be first? Doesn't matter who first. I saw a hand over here. Yes, go ahead.
So we can work two ways. Part of your conversation was saying that Delaware has an opportunity to be a leader, and I seem to feel that our business in Delaware is probably ahead of our state government in addressing some of these issues. With your long history in diplomacy, do you have any pointers for us that we can take to our General Assembly and actually have a regional greenhouse gas initiative legislation coming up this spring? Anything you can tell us to help them endorse this legislation and pass it?
I'll just summarize the question because not everybody can hear the
okay.
person in the audience. So questioner is just asking whether you have any pointers for the state of Delaware, especially for the state legislature, which is considering a number of initiatives actually underway right now to deal with this climate change issue. How do you get them to act and move now?
Well, I think you have been very fortunate to have leadership of several key industries. I think DuPont is really, we have worked with them in recent years, and we've been very impressed with the sort of far-sighted, forward-looking issues that they've grappled with in this issue. And I think that maybe you want to enlist their support. Not to say that the average citizen doesn't have the same amount of clout as anyone else, but I think that that might be something that you would consider. Microphone.
I don't know what the problem is.
Yeah.
I'm going to move it a little farther away.
Okay.
Put it right here and see if that helps.
Okay. I think that I always believe that teamwork is a successful way. I always believe that teamwork is a successful way to operate. And I think you can demonstrate leadership, but ultimately it's the collective support that really is key. And I think if you can get as I talked about the partnerships we have, if you can get a business, civil society or NGO or whatever multi-stakeholder group together, that ought to have tremendous impact. I also find that states like to know what others are doing. I find this to be the case. So maybe if you take a look at what else is happening, see who else you think is a leader in the Mid-Atlantic region or even in New England. Think about some of these things and see what you can do in that area. And, you know, I think that could be a helpful approach as well.
There's a follow-up on that, just a local development. There's, because you mentioned neighboring states, both New Jersey and Delaware are currently considering wind farm initiatives off the coast. Mm-hmm. Is the UN Foundation involved in that kind of initiative, and what's your observation on that?
We're not involved in that particular initiative, but certainly
in those kinds of projects.
Yeah, those kinds of projects. As I said, I think solar geothermal has a lot of exciting potential, and we have been exploring those possibilities. Wind, solar, photovoltaics. Things have changed. You know, it's not your grandmother's solar that it used to be. And I think we have to look at all these possibilities. It's kind of interesting because land use always comes up when people are talking about some of the agro-energy options. And, you know, it's always thought that, well, maybe this is the wrong use of land. But I think if you have, you know, a mixture as you have of some of these alternatives, you have a very good use of land.
Okay, question from a student? Yes. Okay, how does the UN Foundation choose its projects? Do governments come to you and ask for money? Do you reach out and solicit proposals? How does that work?
Well, we were founded to support the mission and causes, the goals of the UN. So we find that we work with initiatives of the UN agencies and with other groups who are supporting those causes. For example, if you are a think tank, an NGO, and you have a proposal that directly relates to the eradication of poverty, in other words, affecting the Millennium Development Goals, that certainly is something that we would consider. And we try to stay true to that line, though, because it's quite possible, given the people who do contact us, the proposals that do come, we could do a variety of things, but we try to stay focused to our mission. We work with governments in the context of the projects that are adopted. We don't necessarily just go directly to the governments unless we are going to see it. We have a sort of multi-government, broad initiative, a regional initiative, then we will get directly involved with governments.
Do you ever find the UN saying to you when you go to them with a specific idea, no, we're already working on that in another initiative with some other funds or perhaps in another region? Do they ever tell you better to channel your efforts elsewhere? How does that balance work between what you decide you're interested in and what the UN decides it's interested in?
Another very good question. One of the important priorities for the UN is what is known as coherence, otherwise known as coordination, trying to avoid duplication. And there are so many agencies. It's like everyone wants a little piece of the pie. And there are a number of agencies that are focused on different aspects of bioenergy. Hopefully, we will work together. There is a organization of UN agencies called UN Energy that tries to coordinate the efforts so we don't have that problem. Try to anticipate what the needs are, get in on the early stages so we are involved in the planning. A number of things that have occurred, no one would realize that UN Foundation was the genesis. We try to be very quietly behind the scenes and encourage, nudge, bring people, organizations, and others together to create a win-win.
Another question? Question from a non-student? Yes, ma'am.
Related to the question just now and what you answered, is it possible for an individual group to approach you, or does it have to go through an official government-related organization?
Question is it possible for an individual group to approach you, to approach the UN Foundation, or does it have to go through a UN agency?
An individual group can approach us as long as it meets the criteria that I mentioned. That falls within the general missions, the foci of the foundation. Yes.
So then you would bring it to the UN and you'd coordinate with them or cohere with them?
Some, yes, or, as I said, it depends. Or if it fits within the Millennium Development Goals or the particular mission of a particular agency working on bioenergy, we might independently just go ahead and do it and say to the agency, we will work with you because we think this will be helpful, and won't you agree? And we work together and we end up doing it as partners.
Okay. Question from a student? Question from a student? Yep.
When it comes to an industrialized nations providing aid to developing countries in order to try to prevent climate change and combat climate change, which industrialized nations would you say are at the vanguard of that?
Okay, question is, if you look at the industrialized nations of the world, which ones are at the vanguard of making progress on climate change issues?
Issues or aid? I'm not sure.
Was it aid or issues? Aid, sorry, okay.
I have to say the Nordic countries have an admirable, very strong record of financial support, as well as there are other European countries as well, but quite admirable. I mean, if you say in the vanguard, you hate to single out one because others are doing a lot as well, but certainly they are.
Maybe give us a couple of examples. What are the Nordic countries doing? What kinds of things are they doing?
Well, they've always had a very strong interest in working on some of the challenging aspects of climate change issues in Africa, and they're providing a large amount of money for those countries to really figure out what is in their interest, how can they change the energy paradigm, and they're doing it in similar ways that we discussed. They're bringing together, often through conferences or small groups, policymakers, helping them to understand what's at stake, either supporting that in various countries in Africa or bringing them to one of the Nordic countries to help there. Austria also, Austria, Germany, lot being done.
Is it hard to get industrial nations which are, to use a colloquial phrase, sort of sitting fat and happy with their development to focus so far down the future? I mean, that film and many of the examples you gave in your talk suggest this is a problem that's going to take a long time to materialize. How do you get policymakers who are elected tomorrow or elected next year and go out of office in a few years to focus on problems that are so far away?
Absolutely true. And I think you do because of the groundswell. I think the question that the lady asked in the beginning, I think, it's a very important question. You want to get the attention of your state legislature. And I mean, it's the combined effort of citizens working across lines, multi-stakeholder, working with business, coming with other groups together. And I think that is what makes short-term politicians pay attention, because they know maybe they won't be in office when this is going to be more critical, but they realize they've got something that they've got to do, that people are going to hold them accountable, because the stewardship piece is a very critical one, and that we need them to really step up to the plate and make these hard decisions now.
So the students who you met at dinner who were talking about getting action sooner, they're taking the right steps by being active now, trying to persuade their elected leaders to act now on a distant problem.
Absolutely.
Okay. Question from, yes, sir.
I have two questions. First is, it seems to me that water is one of the primary problems with Africa and some of these other countries. One of the things that small groups are doing is getting desalinization of the water in Africa. It seems to me if you could get the some bigger funders to back desalinization, it would be helpful to get the water, for example, Darfur is a specific water conservation.
Okay.
Now, wait a minute.
What's your question? Okay, we got the point. You're talking about desalinization. What's your question? Okay. Questioner is pointing out that water is a major issue of contention around the world. Pointed out there are a number of desalinization projects underway around the world. Wants to know if the UN Foundation is engaged in desalinization efforts. And I'll add to that, if you are, or if you're not, either way, what if any, connection is there between a desalinization project and water, provision of clean water around the world, and energy and climate change issues?
Okay. All right. At the moment, we're not involved directly in a desalinization project. We are concerned about water, which is why I spoke about it. We are a partner in the Global Water Challenge, which is being spearheaded by Coca-Cola. And we also, though, are using our role to convene, to be advocates, to bring this issue to the attention of a number of institutions and organizations. The CSD that I mentioned in my remarks, the focus will be on the issue of desertification. They're looking very much at this problem of droughts, desalinization, all of this coming together. And so we support like the CSD programmatic piece, and in that sense we are engaged in trying to bring the attention of people who come to that issue. I will say I know the World Bank does have desalinization projects, and so it's not being ignored. It is an important factor.
Since you mentioned it again here and you mentioned it in class earlier, what is the Global Water Challenge?
It's an opportunity to draw the attention of the world to the scarcity of water resources and what they could do to alleviate it. And there are a series of varying actions, very much the way we talk about what you can do to conserve energy. And so we see this as almost in a partnership piece with what's the challenge of access to energy.
Okay. Question from a student? Yes?
You had stated in your talk about mainly in Africa, there is a lack of access to electricity and water and sanitation facilities. Are there any major efforts underway, either through governments or businesses, to develop the public infrastructure in these countries to help them achieve this goal?
Okay. Questioner points out that in your talk you discussed the lack of access to electricity, water, and sanitation. Questioner said especially in Africa, but it's also true widely in South Asia and elsewhere in Asia for that matter, some of which you mentioned as well. What efforts are you making, what efforts are being made to try to expand that infrastructure so that those countries will have access to those basic fundamental utilities?
I think a number of things are happening which hopefully will finally crack the impasse that seems to have been there with regard to having greater economic development in Africa. The World Bank, the president of the World Bank, President Zelek, has put Africa very much at the top of his agenda. That's particularly important because the bank holds such a huge sway and impact, not just because of the funds it gives, but psychologically and the relationship piece that it has with so many of the other multilateral development banks. And so if you can get the World Bank to, say this is key and this is the direction in which to go, it can be very helpful. And that's important. Another thing is that with the Gleneagles Summit, the G8 in 2005 said we need to put Africa on the agenda. And, every year the G8 has an agenda. But I've been struck, and many others, and it's really having an impact, that among the various themes that the G8 has had, since 2005, Africa has been among those themes. So there's a recognition that it's not a one-shot, let's look at it, we'll spend a few days in some idyllic setting, addressing a few of these things, but no, this is more long-term. Out of that Gleneagles Summit also was created the Global Bioenergy Partnership, and that's the G8 plus 5. And they have decided also they've got to pay a special attention to Africa. There has been probably greater scrutiny in the past 2 years of Africa institutions. There's been a reform in a number of areas. I think that also is going to have a serious effect. It's a complicated process, and it's not going to happen overnight. But I think that governments, the actual commitment of governments, the input of money, a recognition that there is opportunity there so that you get some private sector deal flows, as they say, there could make a difference. I think people tend to be frightened often by the sense of catastrophe. The catastrophe label has stuck in a big way with regard to the continent. So they tend to think of, humanitarian crises, or they think of coups, and it's, really hard to get business to think, as we just said.
They think of corruption, too.
Oh, yes. Many
C's.
Many C's. It's very hard. Business wants a lot of assurances, and they look sometimes and they find it difficult to get the assurances that they need. However, the profit motive is pretty strong, and a lot of businesses are doing extremely well in Africa, despite perhaps some more challenging civil society, not civil society, but civil war situations. So we think maybe we can make some progress.
Who's in the driver's seat in a situation like that? Is it business that's really going to be the initiator of projects that are going to make a difference, or is it government, or is it intergovernmental or international organizations, or does it just have to be whatever works in a specific situation?
You're asking a lot of the great questions. About 7 or 8 months ago, a billionaire foundation supporter said to me in great frustration, it's not money. There's plenty of money. It's everywhere. We've got the money. He said, and usually when you talk from that position, and this is not Ted Turner, this is someone, a European gentleman. But when you talk from that position, you may say, well, it's easy for you to say that. But he said, we're awash in money. Money is not the issue. He said the issue is policy. So when I said leadership, government policy, state legislatures, you need to have those parameters in place in order to really move ahead.
Okay. Question, next question? Yes. Okay, questioner wants to get back to the developing nations. Comments on your statement that many of them don't have electricity. I was in India a year ago and discovered for the first time that 600 million people in that country alone don't have access to electricity. He's asking, why doesn't the UN get in and roll up their sleeves and buy some energy-efficient bulbs and solar panels and bring electricity to those countries? That was the question.
We are trying very hard to encourage people to use the compact fluorescent bulbs, and we're talking about energy efficiency. There are probably programs maybe that I'm not even aware of that are trying to distribute and are distributing bulbs. There are UN agencies that are definitely working and doing that.
If you don't have electricity, though, you can't screw in a light bulb.
I was just going to say, that is the key. I was just going to say, very hard when I talked about we have to leapfrog, we have to think in new ways. You know, it's an issue of how are we going to get access to energy when they're not connected to the grid. So it's tough. But I do want to say those countries where there is poverty, but where they have some limited access, there are programs to help move from the incandescent to the compact fluorescent.
Okay. Question from a student. Yes, sir.
In your speech, you focused on bioenergy and its import. Also, as you mentioned, Brazil is the largest bioenergy producer. However, they produce ethanol by burning sugarcane. By releasing carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, it also causes contamination. Do you think that is a good renewable source? And also, will it really help to stop global warming?
Okay, I'm going to try to paraphrase the question, but correct me if I get it wrong, okay? I think the question boils down to, you highlighted Brazil as a country where they're using a lot of biofuel, and in fact, you talked about how they're using flex engines in vehicles and so on. The questioner wants to know whether using biofuels doesn't also produce carbon emissions, and whether using those fuels really is a solution to climate change. Do I have it about right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, there is some controversy about biofuel use, about does it create more of a problem than it solves. I recognize that. It's not perfect, not totally perfect, but, and I'm not a scientist, so I'm sure you could get perhaps more accurate information about the benefits that come from biofuel use rather than from petroleum. But at the same time, we do think that there is a benefit in terms of benefit for global warming. I'm going to perhaps see you a little later and get your name and perhaps provide you some more detailed information that we'll find more helpful.
Let me piggyback on that by bringing to this forum a question that you were asked in our class this afternoon, which is related to this one, and that is there are people who argue that getting a small country in Africa to switch to biofuels as a crop essentially replaces their ability, or perhaps diminishes their ability, to grow food crops, which they need as well. That's also happening, and you touched on it in your remarks briefly. That's also happening in the United States. How much of that's a political and economic controversy that must come into your discussions at the UN Foundation. Did you have a big debate on that issue and then decide, okay, we're just going to go in this direction because we think the benefits outweigh the losses, or is that debate continuing at the UN Foundation?
Good question. We think...
I'm trying to get a bad one, I promise. I'm trying to get a bad question. Go ahead.
Well, we think that, as I said in the classroom, biofuels is not one size fits all. It's not necessarily a panacea, but it is an option. Agrofuels are an option of opportunity for developing countries, for rural, for changing the possibilities for farmers. And so when you look at, is it food, is it fuel? Ideally, the feedstock it would not be as helpful, let's put it this way, to have it a food source. And I think perhaps there's a recognition in the U.S. that second generation biofuels is the preferred way to go, so that we have less pressure on first generation, which is food-oriented, food-based. But I think in Africa, the challenge is for them to figure out what is really possible. I mean, it may not be biofuels may not be possible for them, but for some countries it will represent a good option. And we have to let them make these decisions, and it gets back to the policy piece. I think they recognize that this is a real tough issue, and I think they also have the possibility for cellulosic. We talked earlier about jatropha, some of the possibilities that jatropha, which is a small tree, a large bush, might have. It's not going to compete with food sources, and would provide also, because of the fact it's cultivated, opportunities also for small holders, smallholder farms. And so I think that it's sort of a mixed situation. As I said, it's not perfect. I know there's been a lot of controversy about it, but the percentage of land under cultivation on biofuels is much smaller than the land that, as I mentioned earlier in the class discussion, the percentage of land that is cultivated. So I think there's a sense, maybe because of the hype that's come from the press, that prices are rising because of the increase in pressure on food sources for biofuels.
You would argue that's not what's causing the price increases.
It's not. As I said, it's a confluence of a lot of things that are happening, and a lot having to do with the choices and options that are occurring in developing countries. But we have to also look at the reality of higher oil prices, and we tend to just look at the increase in food prices. As I said, the chairman of the International Federation of Agricultural Producers, which is the organization of small farmers, said that for years, food prices were dormant, they were flat or in decline, and he said farmers were starving and going out of business, and he said for farmers, this has been an opportunity, and I think the direct quote from him that I gave was, he said, in my 30 years of working on a farm and that I love, this is the first time I feel that I can buy my wife a dress and not feel that I'm having to weigh the other options of our needs. So I think it's a real tough trade-off. It's not an easy decision to be made.
Okay. Another question? Yes, sir?
Just a comment maybe. Biofuels, carbon is being sequestered during the year that the biofuel is processed. That's a recyclable process that's occurring each year, whereas with the coal and petroleum, that carbon is sequestered.
Okay. Dean Apple notes that,
Thank you.
In the food fuel process, the carbon is recaptured and recycled, whereas in the petroleum process it's not. So it's another consideration to take into mind. Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier there's kind of a batch, an expectation of a return on the investment for some of these loans. So they're essentially amounts of loans, some of the funding you provide. You noted that business communities are, or international organizations are more keen on investing if there's a return to be made. But two small questions. One, how do you ensure that the kind of crippling debt doesn't accrue some of these areas that are getting funding? And secondly, what about the areas where there's really not much of an opportunity to make a profit, yet they do need the investment and resources? Does the UN Foundation provide funding to those areas free of the expectation of making a return on investment?
Okay. Questioner is asking a couple of economic questions about remarks you made during your formal remarks. You indicated that in many of the projects, if not all of them, you're looking for repayment of investments that are made up at the front end. So he's asking, how do you avoid a small country, a developing country, getting in over its head in debt and being unable to repay later on? And the second part of the question was, what about areas where you'll never expect a profit or a return on your investment? Does the UN Foundation understand that there are going to be some areas where the money is just going to go in and never come back out?
This is the challenge we're discussing right now. I think absolutely. I gave an example of AOSIS and the small island states, and they're small. I mean, it's very tough to lure investors to, what is the rate of return? So trying to think in a very creative way. As I said, we gave examples. People are thinking maybe a global stock exchange, maybe they could become these living laboratories. I mean, trying to think outside the box, something that would be a catalytic factor that would encourage the private sector, to encourage these billionaires that are really interested in wanting to help into figuring out what they can do. You may have read the article in the New York Times last Saturday, which talked about Richard Branson bringing together a number of people on Necker Island, his island, to really grapple with, talk about the greening aspect and the finance piece and what could and could not be possible. And I think that it's going to require a lot of these kinds of collaborations coming together to think about how they're going to do this so that you avoid these islands. What I didn't mention is in the Safe Islands example, which is the Maldives example I gave, where they create a small island per the region of islands, so that you've got one here and then one here and then one here. That's going to cost $100 million an island. That's at least the rough cost we have. These are obviously not small amounts. So we're right now it's going to be necessary for international organizations and governments perhaps coming together to pool resources, because I think everybody agrees that these are vulnerable states and that they should not be held necessarily hostage to the fact that the finance element is not one that they can readily avail themselves of.
We're at the end of our program. I've got to follow up, though, because with this last little question, when you have that discussion and you have it in an environment where here we are in the middle of an election campaign in which climate change has been It's been discussed, but it's certainly not as at the top of the agenda. How do you is this a discussion you have at a very elite level of people who are looking to the Maldives as a place to invest their $100 million to save an island? How do you have that discussion in the political environment we're in, where it's hardly even on the agenda?
Well, I think that perhaps when we have a definite candidate in both parties, it will be perhaps then on the agenda, because there will be probably a number of things that will get discussed in a more in-depth fashion.
Okay. Well, before we thank Janet Hall tonight, a couple of reminders. Our next Global Agenda program takes place 2 weeks from tonight, Wednesday, April 9th. Our guest will be Dr. John Byrne, who studies and teaches the public policy of energy and climate here at the University of Delaware, and who shared last year's Nobel Prize with Al Gore and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And you've heard Janet talk a lot about policy tonight, so we're going to move in that direction in terms of U.S. domestic and its role with the world in 2 weeks. I know you're going to appreciate his prescription for making sound public policy about climate change issues. Reminder that if you'd like to get email messages about programs like this, put your name on one of those orange sheets out in the lobby on your way out. If you've already done it, no need to do it again. Now let's thank Janet Hall for sharing her ideas with us tonight. And thank you all very much for coming. Good night.